Every phase of life involves different challenges and opportunities and blessings, and all those things could be said of friendship. Friendship, we typically, rightfully, hopefully so, think about the blessings that come from human relationships that we have and share. But because anytime there's another person in the room with us, that person is not exactly like us, and so there are challenges that go into any relationship. In regards to any kind of friendship, I'm not just speaking of marriage. Tonight, everything I talk about would apply to that in some way, but that's not the focus. But just in regards to friendship, who will be included in my circle of friends? And why each person, what is the reason that I have chosen that one to be included? And how long will that friendship last? And how strong is that relationship going to be? When God created Adam in the beginning, He created Eve as well, said it's not good for man to be alone. And while that's definitely the foundation of marriage, in a secondary sense, that's also just a part of human nature, isn't it? The desire for friendship. And so if we easily understand the importance of friends, then hopefully we see the importance of wisdom in those friendships. And that's what I want us to look at tonight. The relationship, the need for wisdom in our friends. And so when we think about wisdom, maybe we quickly think about Solomon. And so let's think about some things that Solomon had to say, and then even in his life, that help us to gain some wisdom in this area. And so I thought we would start with Ecclesiastes chapter 4, probably or at least one of the most well-known passages that focuses on wisdom in friendship. Read with me verses 9 through 12. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion, but woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm, but how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So while this passage might often be, you might hear it most often read at a wedding, nothing he says here is limited to marriage. Marriage is just one kind of friendship. But this passage provides a good way to teach the value of friendship. But what I want you to notice especially is that he doesn't say 2 is better than 1, period. 2 is only better than 1 under what circumstances that he describes here. Well, only if you're with someone that if you fall, they're actually going to help you up, and as we say, not kick you when you're down. In that case, I think I'd rather fall by myself than have someone who's with me who's not going to help me. So Ecclesiastes 4, Solomon is teaching wisdom that it's good to be with another, but choose well who you are with. Then go over to the book of Proverbs. I want to look at several there. We might initially think, well, if I'm going to serve God, I should just be friends with everybody. Well, actually, that's not true. The book of Proverbs tells us several people to avoid and that should not be included in your friends. Proverbs 22, verses 24 and 25. A proud and haughty, make no friendship with an angry man, and with the furious man do not go, lest you learn his ways and set a snare for your soul. 2 lessons we learn about friendships here. He gives one very specific example that if you notice someone has the trait, has the habit, they're quickly angry, they're often angry, then he says, avoid that person. Don't include that person in your closest circle of friends. But then there's another lesson that he teaches in verse 25 that could be true not just of someone with that weakness, but of any. Verse 25, he reminds us that your friends, you're going to learn something from your friends. Now, it's true, we can be a light and an example. We can help others, and we can help others even who are not our friends. We can help strangers and be a good example. That's true. But a friendship involves a mutual relationship in some ways. And so I hope you can influence your friends, but don't ignore verse 25 that says you are also going to be influenced by your friends. don't be tricked into thinking it's going to be a one-way street. You can influence them, but they will influence you. And so choose well and carefully. Next, Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 19. Proverbs 25, verse 19. Confidence in an unfaithful man in time of trouble is like a bad tooth and a foot out of joint. This is teaching, be careful who you trust. And that would be true in general, but you're really going to learn that lesson. If you trust someone who does not deserve that trust, then in a time of trouble when you need them the most, it's going to affect them, but it's going to affect you like a bad tooth affects you, like a sprained ankle affects you. And then when trust is broken, there are all kinds of consequences that come from that, the effect upon you. And then how is that relationship going to be mended? Well, if I had confidence in someone who was not trustworthy, it's going to take time for them to earn that trust back. And so be careful who you trust and make trust be earned. Don't quickly and immediately trust others. Give time to earn that trust. Now, of course, Jesus teaches us to forgive. We have to forgive, but that's not the same as immediate and full confidence or trust again. Forgiveness is not earned. Trust is. Go to Proverbs chapter 6. Proverbs chapter 6. Again, we might think initially, well, if we're going to be like God and more like God, that would mean, doesn't God want to be friends with everyone? So shouldn't I want to be friends with everyone? Or isn't God friends with everyone? Proverbs chapter 6, beginning in verse 16, the answer is no. These 6 the Lord hates. Yes, 7 are an abomination to him. I won't read the whole list, but drop down to verse 19. God hates a false witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord among brethren. So God offers, it's true God offers to be a friend to all, but he's not actually a friend to all, because there are some whom even God hates. Does God hate? Does God hate people? He does, because this doesn't just say that he hates the lie, and he hates the gossip or the discord, but he hates the tongue, and he hates the false witness. Now, what we have to notice from other passages is God can actually love someone and hate them at the same time. If they make themselves his enemy, he hates them, but at the same time he's offering reconciliation and offering to forgive them. So God actually can do both. And we simply have to learn those traits from him. So Solomon gives us some wisdom about what we should avoid in friendships. And then in Proverbs chapter 27, there are several things that teach us here the criteria, so to speak, the way that we should choose friends. Proverbs chapter 27, I'll start first of all with verse 17. Proverbs 27:17. As iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. So choose a friend that makes you stronger. Oh, I'm sorry, that says 27 verse 1. That should say verse 17. Choose a friend who makes you sharper, who makes you stronger. In other words, first they do things that are right. That's a good place to start. But then they help you do things that are right and good, and they help you do them even better. And maybe just a simple illustration would be in a Bible class. Someone who, if they're at the class, that's good. And then they help the class, they help the learning to be better by their comments, by their conduct. Now that's just one example. Next, look at verses 5 and 6. I must have accidentally deleted the end of that. Proverbs 27:17, and then verses 5 and 6. Open rebuke is better than love carefully concealed. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. What would you call someone who stabbed you? Parents, have you ever allowed someone to stab your children? Well, you have, maybe with a small needle, giving them some shot. So there are some wounds that are given by a friend, and that's different than the wound of an enemy. And Solomon says here, find the kind of people who will stab you, but only with a small needle, for your benefit. They'll wound you. They'll say something to you that's hard to hear, that hurts to hear, because they notice you're doing something you shouldn't, moving in a direction that isn't good. Find a friend who's willing to tell you those things. And then verse 9, ointment and perfume delight the heart, and the sweetness of a man's friend gives counsel or gives delight by hearty counsel. And so find a friend who speaks in a way that what they say is like ointment. What they say is like perfume. It's something that makes something, again, already good, more enjoyable, more pleasant, as opposed to our society even has that word, someone is toxic. And I think that's the opposite of what this is saying. Someone who can help and enhance the things in life that are already pleasurable and enjoyable. Someone who offers ideas and advice, not only that are helpful, but especially someone who's interested in the most important things. Find someone interested and who is useful in those most important things. Now the irony is that, there they went, sorry. The irony is that Solomon said all these things that were very wise, but either he said them after he kind of learned them by experience in some way, in addition to what the wisdom that God miraculously gave them, or he didn't use them when he chose to marry. 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 1 tells us that Solomon loved many women, and he married women from all different nations. At least some of that was probably a political kind of a career move, that his thinking was, I want to be as successful as a king as I can, so the more alliances I make with others, then the better. That'll be a good career decision. And then a good financial decision. He could make different trade agreements with the nations, and so he would marry the daughters of kings of a variety of nations. So none of us are going to be a king, but the point here, he thought this was a good career decision. He thought this was a good financial decision, and in reality, it was neither, because those wives led his heart away from the Lord. Because he chose to make some of these women his closest companion, because they encouraged him to compromise his faith, it undermined his career, as we might call it, but of course also the result was undermining his faith. We don't have details of what his life was like on a daily basis, but if we did, my guess is that if we went back and read those Proverbs again about what to avoid in friends, that would be some of the characteristics of these women that he brought into his life and into his family. Women who complicated his life more than they eased and simplified his life. And as I mentioned a moment ago, anytime you've got two people in the room, yes, things are a little bit more complicated than if I'm in there by myself, but Ecclesiastes 4, actually there can be others that, while life may be more complicated in some ways, as a whole, my life is simplified if I have someone else who is with me. But my guess is that Solomon did not have those kind of women. Marriage and friendship in general shouldn't complicate life as a whole. It should simplify and enhance life more than complicate it. But I think we have some reflection of Solomon's experience in Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 26. He says, "And I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and whose hands are fetters." Now that's quite a contrast from Song of Solomon, isn't it? But both are written by the same. But I think this reflects 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 1. And I don't think he's saying anything here unique to women. I would suppose that Abigail, do you remember Nabal and Abigail in 1 Samuel 25? She would probably say about the same thing. She was married to a hard-headed man. I think it was her own servant who said he's a scoundrel, and she didn't disagree with him. And so Abigail might say the same thing from the other side of that. So Solomon offers us some wisdom, not just in the area of marriage, but in general, in regards to our friendships. And so if we know the value of friendships, then we should learn the value of wisdom. Then in Luke chapter 11 and verse 31, Jesus said that one greater than Solomon is here. And of course, Jesus was speaking of himself. What makes Jesus greater than Solomon? Well, of course, Jesus' nature. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That was not Solomon, but Jesus was in the beginning. And Jesus was God in the beginning, and Jesus was with God, the Father, and even the Spirit in the beginning. And so, in that way, Jesus, of course, is greater. Jesus is the Christ. John 11, verse 27. He is the one whom God chose. Jesus is the Son of God. That means that Jesus humbled himself to serve the Father. But Jesus, being the Son of God, also is teaching that he's of the same nature. A father and a son are the same kind of whatever they are. And so Jesus is the same as the Father in his nature. He's deity. And so Jesus is greater than Solomon in wisdom because, first of all, the foundation that he is God. Turn over to Matthew chapter 5. Jesus showed that he's not only greater than Solomon because of his nature and his wisdom, but Jesus, Romans 5, verse 8, gave himself for even his enemies, died for those who were still sinners. But in Matthew 5, read with me verses 44 through 48. What does Jesus teach us about friendship? Matthew 5:44. But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. And pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. So what does Jesus teach us about friendship here? Well, this isn't so much focused on friendship, but Jesus says something about our enemies, that we should love our enemies. Now, does that mean that we should be friends with everyone? That we should consider ourselves friends of those who are our enemies? And the answer to that is no. Number one, when Jesus says love here, there is a love that's a friendship kind of love. And that's not the word he uses. The word he uses here is that love that's not out of how I feel, but it's a love that comes from how I think about others. Regardless of how they act towards me, my conduct, my attitude is not going to be defined by their decisions. My thinking towards them is going to be defined by God's decisions and God's instructions. So I can love my enemy in that way. But then go over to the book of James. I'll start in James chapter 2. James chapter 2, verse 8. And I'll just remind you that James was the half-brother of Jesus, and he was also an elder in Jerusalem. So he was a prophet. He was an elder. He was by blood, of course, through Mary, related to Jesus in that way. James chapter 2, verse 8, he says, if you really fulfill the royal law according to the Scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you do well. So James says you are a neighbor to everyone. And I think these terms are significant. Everyone is your neighbor. You are a neighbor to everyone. But everyone is not your friend. You should not be a friend to everyone. Look at chapter 4 and verse 4. We can be a friend, or we can be a neighbor and not a friend. Someone else can be our neighbor, but not be our friend. James chapter 4, verse 4, we can't have universal friendship because he says, adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Now, James isn't saying you cannot be a friend with someone who is not a Christian, but friendship involves something in common. It involves some degree of a commitment. And he says you can't participate and in that sense be a friend with those who participate in sin. Friendship involves some degree of commitment and something in common. And so if I give a commitment to join in sin with someone, then in that sense I'm their friend and I make myself an enemy of God. James says those two cannot go together. But now turn back to John chapter 15. What could we learn from Jesus about the friendship that he offers? Look in John chapter 15. Jesus offers his friendship to all of the world. That's true. But the friendship of Jesus in some ways is different than the friendship that you and I might offer to someone or even have with someone. There are just some things about Jesus that make him different than you and I, aren't there? The fact that he is creator and lawgiver and judge, the fact that he is God, the fact that Jesus instantly and immediately knows the thoughts, the heart, the motive, the intent of others, that makes him different than you and me. So he can be the perfect judge of others. And he's proven, we have, as I mentioned a moment ago, trust has to be earned, but Jesus has already earned that. And so no one can say, well, I'll wait and see how Jesus is going to handle. Well, no, he gave himself for us. Greater love has no man, as we'll read in just a moment, than that he would give his life. And while we were still sinners, Christ died for the ungodly. So Jesus doesn't have anything left to prove. He offers his friendship. He has proven he is trustworthy. But now read with me John chapter 15, verses 9 through 14, and what Jesus says about this friendship that he offers. Jesus is speaking to the apostles. So some things he says in these chapters are unique to that relationship, but generally here, what he says, I think, would be generally true. John 15, verse 9, as the Father loved me, I also have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may remain in you, and that your joy may be full. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. You are my friends if you do whatever I command you. So, of course, the disciples, they were Jesus, I think it's safe to say, they were Jesus' closest earthly friends. And here's some of the things he says about friendship with him would not really be true of the friendship we might offer to someone. Would you tell someone, or would you accept someone as a friend if they said, well, I'll be your friend if you do everything that I tell you? That doesn't really work with human relationships. That's what I mean, that Jesus' friendship is a little bit different, but there's a reason for that. Because you don't have any earthly friend, and that person knows so much that you could totally trust their knowledge across the board so that you would do anything that they said. There's no one like that. There's no one that you could trust so much. You could trust them absolutely so that anything they told you to do, you would do it absolutely without question. There's no one like that. And you don't have any earthly friend who is so righteous in the past and present and the future that you would never question anything that they did or that they told you to do, you would just automatically do it. So it's true what Jesus says in verse 14 at first doesn't sound like a typical friendship, because it isn't a typical friendship. This is friendship with He who in the beginning was with God and who is God. Jesus is greater than Solomon in wisdom, but He's greater because of what He offers to you and to I and to all the world and to every creature. And if it's hard to imagine a friendship with someone who just tells us what to do, well, then we just need to understand His love a little bit better. 1 John chapter 5 and verse 3, that this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not burdensome. So everything that Jesus tells us to do, He tells us to do as a friend. He tells us for our benefit, not for His benefit. He doesn't benefit from our willingness to accept and to receive Him. But we can't have His love if we don't keep His commandments. But we can trust His commandments because we can absolutely trust Him. And if we wrestle with that, it just means we need to better understand the nature of the love of God and the friendship that Jesus offers as He extends Himself. But then last, let's look at the other side of that. If Jesus offers to be a friend, well then what's my response? If I want to be a friend of Jesus, if I want to be a friend of God, what does that require of me? And turn to James chapter 2. This would be one of the best passages for that, because it uses this language that Abraham was a friend of God. Doesn't mean they were buddies and pals in that sense as equals. Of course they were not equals. Of course we are not equals. But God offers to make us who are inferior to Him, He's willing to use the word friend toward us. But here's what part of that requires. James chapter 2, see what we can learn from Abraham about being a friend of God. Let's read this section in its entirety, verses 20 through 24, and then we'll walk back through it. James 2, verse 20. But do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works? And by works, faith was made perfect or complete. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. You see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith only. So what do we learn from Abraham about being the friend of God? Look at verse 21. This sounds like an odd friendship. The friend, God, told his friend Abraham to do what? Something that you would not do if any other friend told you to do. Told him to take his son Isaac, with all that was invested in Isaac, and offer him as a burnt offering. Not only kill him, but offer him as a burnt offering. So part of the key here, of course, is faith. Faith comes by hearing. If Solomon were to, or if Abraham were to do this as his own idea of righteousness, then what would we call it? It would be murder. And in the Old Testament, the Israelites sometimes imitated the sins of the idol worshippers and offered their children. So sometimes God in the Bible is criticized because of this occasion. What makes this different is faith comes by hearing. You have the lawgiver. God is over all life. So the lawgiver has the right to say, well, this one's life is going to end. We recognize that in our government. I can't go out and just kill someone that's murder. But if the government says, well, this person has committed a crime worthy of death, then they're just in ending that one's life, and that killing is not murder. In this case, God, who is over all life, He has the right to tell Abraham, end the life of Isaac. And there's no injustice in that. God can take care of Isaac, whether Isaac lives or dies. So there's no problem here. with the justice of God. But Abraham was willing to do this because it was by faith. Remember what I said a moment ago. We don't have any friend who is so knowledgeable and wise and righteous that we would just do everything absolutely that they say. But God checks all those boxes. And so Abraham was willing to do this by faith. And that's what would make this not murder, but this would make it a lawful killing if Abraham had been required to go through with it. But this is what God told Abraham. Next in verse 22, Abraham believed everything that God had promised, and Hebrews 11 even gives us a little bit of insight that Abraham was trying to figure this out, that, well, how can I kill my son who is the son of promise? And Abraham thought, oh, God will just raise him from the dead. And so we see Abraham doing what we would no doubt all do in that circumstance. But he followed every instruction that God gave him. And this is important in verse 22 that he says everything Abraham was doing, his faith was working. And that might be a phrase for you to underline or make a note of somewhere, or just remember if you have studies or conversations with people who struggle to understand that we would have to respond to God in any way, and that we're somehow earning salvation if we do some kind of action in response to God. Here, faith is working. Faith is working. Think about in Abraham, every way his faith was working. When he traveled for 3 days, his faith was working. As he loaded up the wood, and then he and Isaac carried it up the mountain, the mount, their faith was working. When they built an altar, assuming there was not already an altar there, faith was working. When Abraham took a knife of some kind and raised it, faith was working. And from the time that God first gave this instruction, Abraham's faith was incomplete until he did all that God instructed him. And from beginning to end, Abraham did all that was instructed to him. And so he was called, verses 23 and 24, Abraham was called a friend of God. James uses this to help us to understand. Here's the nature of the friendship. Not two equals. God gives the instructions, but he gives the instructions as a friend. And when they are given to a friend, then faith works. So James helps us to see no one is a friend of God by faith only, but faith must work. Now think a little bit with me about Abraham. Did Abraham earn anything by doing what he was told, by traveling for 3 days, carrying the wood, building the altar, pulling the knife? Did he earn anything by it? Did he earn friendship with God by that? No, Abraham wouldn't claim that. James doesn't claim that. He doesn't say that he earned anything. But God offered the gift of this friendship and of all of the promises. And when Abraham's faith worked together with his works, then Abraham was called the friend of God. Now Abraham didn't earn anything, but did he benefit in any way? Of course he benefited. His faith grew. No doubt Isaac's faith grew. I don't know, as they went back home, did Abraham tell Sarah about all this? I don't know for sure, but whoever else in his household learned about it, their faith grew. When we read of this account in the Old Testament, remember it was Moses writing to the Israelites, telling them about their history. Their faith grew. And then, what about you? What about me? My point is, we benefit. We benefit from being a friend of God. And so we have no greater choice for a friend than the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. We have no greater friend. And then last, turn to Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10, if I'm going to be a friend of God, Matthew chapter 10, Jesus reminds us that God will not just be one in a circle of friends. Matthew chapter 10, read with me verses 32 to 39. Therefore, whoever confesses me before men, him I will also confess before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, him I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven. Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it. So, Jesus did not come to force everybody to be his friend. He offered it, but didn't force it. Jesus didn't even come to make everybody in the world everybody else's friend. He offers a path for that, but knew it wasn't going to happen because of sin. But a friend of God not only chooses God as a friend, but if being a friend of God means I choose God over every friend, over every family member, and even in verse 39, I choose God over who? I choose God over myself. That's what it means to be a friend of God. And so friendship, they teach us about commitment. Friendships teach us about priority. But ultimately, friendship comes down to this. Who do I most want to please? That's the answer to my friendship. Who do I most want to be with? Who do I love the most? Friendships can be hard because sometimes other people change. Friendships can be hard because sometimes we change or just circumstances change out of both of our control. But that's a part of what makes God our greatest friend, that God does not change. As He was, He is, and He always will be. And so let's seek the knowledge and let's seek wisdom in the friendships of life and in this friendship that God offers that literally outlives our life on this earth. In eternity, we will spend eternity with our best friend. As Joshua said, and as we sing this song, choose today who you will serve. Turn to number 341 and answer the question for yourself. Who is your greatest friend? Who do you love the most? Who do you want to please the most? Who do you want to serve the most? If you're here tonight and know that you're not a Christian, then the same friendship, the same love that was available to Abraham is available to you and to I through Jesus Christ. If you're ready to repent of your sin and confess your own faith, if you will be baptized, if we can help you, then you will be called a friend of God. If you need to return to that friendship and we can help you, we're happy to do that. The song will prepare us for another week to live as a friend of God. If we can help you tonight in these or any way, come forward, tell us how as we stand and sing.